Hey there, Sam. So in the last video, we talked about how Laravel handles an incoming request and sends back a HTTP response by using the kernel. But what's inside the kernel anyway? Let's find out. And now we're in the kernel file. On the first glance, it looks pretty scary. We have middleware, which is an array of classes, and then we have middleware groups, and again, an array of middleware grouped by a key. By default, it only has two groups, web and API. And scrolling a little bit further down, we have routes middleware, which is basically key and value pairs of middleware. So what is going on here? Before we move on, we first need to understand what is exactly a middleware. Middleware, to put it simply, is just a function that runs before the request hits our router. Middleware is one of the MVC core components. If you're not familiar with MVC, I highly recommend you to watch my other video where I talked about MVC in details. The link is in the description. And here is a brief explanation on how middleware works. Suppose the right-hand side is the server environment. When the HTTP request first came in, the request will first pass through a series of middleware before the request hits the router. And the router will then pass on the request to the other components inside the app. A middleware is just a function that contains logic to either modify the request or act as a security guard to check whether the request should be allowed to continue to go inside our app or not. Let's go back to our code. In Laravel, middleware is in the form of a class. Just by looking at the class name, we kind of know what these middleware are doing. These middleware, as described in the documentation, are global middleware that runs through every request. Let's look at a few intuitive ones here. For example, the prevent request during maintenance middleware would not allow any request to pass through if we're in maintenance mode. The trim strings middleware would cut off any blank space on the left and right hand side of all the request fields. And the convert empty strings to now, as the name suggests, will convert empty strings in the request to now. And now let's learn how to create our own middleware. Middleware in Laravel is just a class. The easiest way to create a middleware is to use the php artisan command. Let's go to our terminal and type in php artisan make middleware and followed by our middleware class name. And just for demonstration, I'll give it a stupid name. I'll just call it say cheese middleware. The middleware creator will be located in our app folder, http middleware and say cheese middleware. Inside the file, you can tell it's a very simple class with just one method. Code handle. The handle method will contain the logic of the middleware. And it has two arguments, request and next. Request is a representation of the incoming HTTP request. And next is a callback function to call the next middleware. Because middleware is a series of security guards in our app, if we don't call the next callback function, that means the current middleware has failed and our app will block the current request to prevent it from moving further into our app. So here, just for demonstration, I'll dump a string when the request passed through our say cheese middleware. And we'll go back to our kernel.php and put our middleware at the very top of our middleware list. Let's try our code. Let's go to the terminal and run php artisan serve to start a development web server. Go to our browser and we see hey cheese as part of our response. Now let's see what happens if we don't call the next function. Let's go back to our middleware. Instead of returning a result of the next function, I'm going to return now. We'll go back to our browser again, hit refresh, and we see an error. What happened here is that the handle method in the middleware should either return another middleware, which is the result of the next function, or a HTTP response. So if we don't want to move on to the next middleware and return a JSON response, we should return a new JSON response object and pass in a payload. So back in our browser and hit refresh, we now see our JSON response inside the body. Now just to show you, the next function is actually calling the next middleware. I'm going to go back to kernel. And trust proxies is the next middleware in line in the middleware series. So let's go in there and override the handle method, and I'll dump another string. So now back inside our cheese middleware, if we call the next function, we should see hey trust proxies inside the browser. Let's give it a go, hit refresh, and there we go. And if we don't call the next function, we'll no longer see our hey trust proxy string. Let's go back to our browser again, and we're back to before. And that is middleware in a nutshell. Now that you understand more about middleware, we can go back and talk more about the kernel. Inside the kernel file, we have three middleware-related properties. The middleware array, which is the global middleware. The middleware groups, where we can group middleware under one key. So the web middleware group here would represent all the middleware that we see inside this array. And the same applies to the API group. Once we created this group, We can then assign a group name to our routes, which you'll see later when we learn more about routes in a future video. And for the routes middleware array, we can assign a middleware alias to a certain middleware class. For example, the authenticate middleware class has an alias of auth, and authorize has an alias of can. So once we have given a middleware an alias, just like the documentation described here, we can assign them to middleware groups or use them individually in any routes. The throttle request middleware has an alias of throttle. So if we go back up to the middleware groups, we can see it being used inside the API group. However, the alias looks a bit different here. It has a colon and a string API. So if we put a colon after any alias, whatever comes after the colon becomes the parameter to be passed on to the handle method in the middleware. So in this case here, we're passing the string API as an additional argument to the throttle request middleware. So if we look inside the throttle middleware, we can see inside the handle method, the string API is going to pass as the max attempt argument. Alright, let's move on. Now I want to talk about what the kernel is doing behind the scene. Let's go back to our kernel and we'll navigate to the base HTTP kernel class. The primary function of this class is the handle method, because it is what being called inside the index.php file. So what's going on inside this handle method? The main thing to look after here is this send request through router method. Let's take a look inside it. And the documentation here says that this function will send a given request through the middleware or router. And if we read the code here, we kind of can tell that it is sending a request through the middleware and then dispatch it to the router. But before that code is being executed, there's an interesting line here that calls the bootstrap method inside this class. Let's look at what's inside it. And it says bootstrap the application for HTTP request. Let's take a look at what is the bootstrappers. And we see an array of bootstrappers that basically tells us what they're doing. Bootstrap is just another word for setting up the application. So from here, we can tell that the bootstrap method is doing the following task for us. It loads the environmental variables, loads the app configuration, handle exception, register facades and providers. You might be unfamiliar with the concept of facades and providers, but don't worry. I promise I'll talk more about them in details in a future video. For now, just think of them as the core components in Laravel for the application to work. And the bootstrap method is just helping us to set up these components. So back to our send request through router method. This method will simply set up the application and pass our request through the middleware and the router. So in summary, the handle method inside the kernel will bootstrap the app and send a request to the router through a series of middleware and return us a response. And back inside index.php, we then call the send function to send a response back to the client just before we terminate the application. Now let's take a look at what's happening inside the terminate method of the kernel. The terminate method, based on the documentation here, will simply call the terminate method on any middleware if they exist. So in every middleware, other than the handle method, we can actually define another method called terminate, which will be run by the kernel terminate method. Let's try this out. We'll go back to our cheese middleware and create a new method called terminate. And the terminate method should accept two arguments, the request and response. And all I'm going to do here is to dump by. So if we go back to our browser and refresh, scroll down and we see by as the last element in the response. And that's it. That's a quick overview on kernel and middleware. Key takeaway for this lesson: middleware are functions that run before the request hits the router. The handle method in the middleware contains the main logic, and the terminate method cleans up the app just before the app is shut down. The kernel is responsible to pass the request to the router through a series of middleware. The kernel bootstraps the application by setting up the environment variable in the .env file and the configuration of our app, exception handling, and register facade and service provider. That's it for now, and I'll see you again in the next video. If you enjoyed the content of this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and the bell icon for more content to come. It will really help me out. Thanks for the support.